Good evening, everyone. My name is Dana Sloter, and I'm here to tell you that the clarinet is weird. That's probably not where you thought we would begin tonight, but here we are. Your suspicions have been confirmed. The clarinet is weird, acoustically, historically, and thus pedagogically. Acoustically, the clarinet is the only instrument with a cylindrical bore that's open at one end and closed at the other. This means we overblow at the 12th rather than the octave like literally everyone else. Historically, it was a long walk to get from the recorder, the Renaissance ancestor of the clarinet, to the chalumeau, an early instrument that played only fundamental pitches relatively low in tessitura pictured on the left, to the first clarinet, an instrument that played only high notes pictured on the right, first mentioned in an instrument order to Johann and Christoph Denner in 1710. In the early 18th century, the chalumeau and first clarinet coexisted, acting as two sides of the same single reed coin, one playing low and the other playing high. Even so, the chalumeau slowly went out of fashion, and the clarinet's range expanded to encompass both very low and very high notes as the design was refined, thanks to the addition of keys and other technical improvements made by the likes of Hyacinthe Closet and Louis-Auguste Boffet. During this period of mechanical development and refinement, the orchestra was used as a kind of lab ensemble, where clarinet players and their instruments were pushed to their limits, performing the newest repertoire by the hottest composers of the day. As a result, most of the important clarinet repertoire from this period consisted of excerpts from orchestral parts, rather than solo literature or chamber music. And when significant solo or chamber repertoire was published, it was written for virtuosi. After the turn of the 20th century, the clarinet repertoire exploded as composers began experimenting with new combinations of instruments in chamber settings and new sounds in solo settings. However, in the private clarinet studio, particularly at the upper high school and undergraduate level, the pool of pieces considered important and worthy of study have stayed the same. These are mostly drawn from that period of intense technical development in the 18th and 19th centuries, even as the world outside the studio has changed dramatically in terms of pedagogical considerations, practical reality, and cultural concerns. There is a gap of sorts that exists between the repertoire often offered to students early in their instruction, such as solo collections compiled and edited by the eminent Jaime Voxman, and the canonic repertoire that every clarinetist should know, and that most clarinetists are taught as they prepare to enroll in lessons at the undergraduate level. In describing this gap, I found it useful to consult the scholarship of Dr. Olivia Meadows. Though her research is chiefly concerned with commissioning unaccompanied works that progressively introduce extended techniques to developing clarinetists, the language from her doctoral dissertation is the basis for my definition of the gap. The leap in difficulty level between the group of commonly taught unaccompanied solos, solos with piano, and solos with ensemble for upper high school and undergraduate students. Specifically, the leap in difficulty as students begin to apply fundamental clarinet technique with historical and theoretical context provided by the core music curriculum. The point is this: the leap from solo collections to standard repertoire and from one piece to another within the standard repertoire is often too wide for students to cross successfully. The studio teachers often end up teaching each important piece in such a way that is reminiscent of classroom teachers being forced to teach the test to fulfill district-wide curriculum obligations. Believe me, I understand the logic behind this approach. Studio teachers want to help their high school students prepare for honor bands, solo and ensemble contests, and college auditions. And assigning something standard is often encouraged or straight up required. At the undergraduate level, the situation is even more stressful, with the benefits of higher education often being reduced in rhetoric and practice to high-priced skills training that is rigorous for the sake of rigor. In music, we often unwittingly feed into this cycle by sticking to a predetermined program of only teaching the tried and true canonic repertoire without interrogating why those pieces are canonic, or if there's room in the canon for other teachable pieces. This This is the way it is, but not the way it has to be. The clarinet's uniquely weird historical circumstances and its effect on repertoire almost require teachers to come up with creative methods to fill these gaps, commissions and transcriptions among them. The aforementioned Dr. Meadows endeavored to close the gap with commissions targeted to teach particular extended techniques. Dr. Andrew DeBoer added long-form, late Romantic British repertoire to the clarinet canon through his transcriptions of York Bowen's works for viola and piano. As for me, I decided to use the Institute for Composer Diversity's Works Diversity Database set up by Ashley Killam to mine the catalogs of women composers for pieces featuring the clarinet. I divided them into 6 categories: unaccompanied solos, solos with a variety of electronic media, solos with piano, solos with ensemble, chamber works featuring 2 to 6 players, and chamber works featuring 7 to 15 players. Once this work was completed for now, I focused on the unaccompanied solos, solos with piano, and solos with ensemble listed in my large database, because these would be the pieces I would mostly be assigning and teaching in a studio environment. I tracked down scores and recordings, assigned them a difficulty level, described particular challenges and/or helpful features in each piece, and if possible, determined a preliminary place where these pieces would fit in the existing standard teaching repertoire. This effort for these 3 categories yielded a total of 1,196 pieces, 504 unaccompanied solos, 486 solos with piano, and 206 solos with ensemble, most of which I had never heard performed before. I won't mince words. This was a significant project in and of itself. It took a long time. Whenever I describe this process of detective work, uncovering seldom played and/or forgotten repertoire, I am inevitably asked, why? Why do you do this? Why go through all this work? Is there room to care about Augusta Holmes and Valerie Coleman as much as Hindemith or Mozart or Brahms? After careful consideration, my argument for a large-scale structural infusion of repertoire by women composers into the clarinet studio can be divided into 3 parts that feed each other: pedagogical considerations, practical reality, and cultural concerns. Pedagogical considerations were my initial entry point into this project. I was bothered by the fact that the pool of clarinet pieces that are considered canon is very small. These pieces are listed on the slide and include the Brahms sonatas, the Mozart concerto, the Nielsen concerto, and the Rossini introduction, theme, and variations, to name drop a few. Stylistically, these pieces cover Mozart's sense of classical structure and melodic development, Rossini's highly decorated bel canto writing style in an instrumental context, Brahms's late Romantic and deeply chromatic style, and Nielsen's modern yet vaguely nationalistic tendencies, among others. However, the path between each of these pieces is sometimes difficult to discern, for even pieces of the same form, such as the Solo de Concours, offer wildly different manifestations of core issues, such as intonation in particular registers of the clarinet. The gaps between these pieces are often so wide that students attempting to move from one to the other are unsuccessful, even with instruction. In this scenario, the studio teacher has to pull the student along as they, the teacher, run through their rehearsed, curated program of teaching the piece. Although the students are receiving instruction, the new piece is an uncomfortable fit. Psychologist Leo Vygotsky theorized that particularly effective teachers present new material to their students that includes a mixture of both established and novel skills, falling into what he called the zone of proximal development, or ZPD. However, if a teacher is more concerned with covering canonic repertoire without seriously reconciling the skills involved with the individual student's development, that repertoire lies outside the ZPD, in the white area on the pictured graphic labeled "What I Can't Do." The student may pull off a successful performance, but it ends up translating to a specific musical experience that students have difficulty transferring from piece to piece as part of the holistic development of their individual and independent learning process. Furthermore, the trajectory of a student through standard repertoire often isn't a linear path. Each student will require attention and re-attention to specific concepts addressed by scales, technical studies, etudes, and repertoire, which Vygotsky addressed more generally with the spiral conception of individual development. Specifically, filling skill gaps in the standard teaching repertoire with pieces by women composers that fall within a particular student's ZPD would end up making performing the most difficult standard repertoire more attainable in the long run and act as part of a balanced musical diet. Practically speaking, recruiting students to enroll as music majors, minors, or non-major participants at the undergraduate level requires a lot of effort. It is a continuous task that is all-consuming for faculty and administrative staff, particularly for smaller, more insular music departments in which applied instrument faculty teach every student in the studio. As someone who has taught music majors from various degree programs, music minors carrying other major degrees, and non-major participants receiving music scholarships while pursuing a multitude of career paths, I can confidently say that the base skill level possessed by incoming first-year students is uneven, and that's no one's fault. Some students come in with a significant amount of private study and performance experience. Others find themselves in lessons having never had any private study aside from pull-out lessons with their high school band director, who may or may not have played the clarinet themselves. There should be room for both of these groups and everyone in between to have an educationally appropriate and artistically fulfilling studio experience, but the teacher has to be willing to make room. For minors and non-majors, there's plenty of breathing room. In that case, I firmly believe that not every clarinet student needs to learn the entire canonic repertoire, especially if doing so will be an unmanageable, painful experience that doesn't allow them to be successful within their ZPD. Though these students may not end up playing in major symphony orchestras, their successes are worthwhile pursuits. They are more likely to continue playing as an avocation in community groups and private lessons as adults, to buy tickets to classical music events, and to donate to fine arts programs if their experience illuminates the possibilities for their particular brand of music making. With classical music audiences continuing to dwindle as they have for decades, I believe it is the duty of studio teachers to invest in the purposeful education of students who grow up to be our pharmacists, insurance agents, and school teachers. The audience is a workforce that needs to be seriously considered and purposefully inspired too. For music majors, a teacher's repertoire program will depend on their future goals. Auditioning for an advanced degree will likely necessitate a basically comprehensive survey of standard teaching repertoire. However, something to keep in mind is the fact that advanced degrees often contain a research requirement as part of their core curriculum, in which students are encouraged to pursue their peripheral interests that somehow still relate to their major field of study. How unbelievably stultifying would it be for an incoming clarinet master's student to write a long-form paper about the Brahms clarinet sonatas, or the excerpts from Beethoven's symphonies, or the logical contradictions in the printed instructions in Stravinsky's 3 pieces. Truly, those texts have been written already, many times over. Studio teachers have power in their assignment and direction of repertoire to spark interest and creativity in their students that can turn into lifelong scholarly pursuits. Often, students themselves will force the issue. They'll walk into the studio and say, "I want to play something different. Can you help me?" How will you answer? Will you have formed an opinion, thought about your student as a person, and made a good faith effort to respond to their question authentically? Is your studio a school of life, as advocated by the Danish philosopher N.F.S. Grundtvig? More explicitly, is the studio a space where our students and us are seen as people in process rather than a series of benchmarks and competencies, as Kevin M. Gannon describes in Radical Hope, a teaching manifesto? Is curiosity invited as a vital part of the student's journey and responded to in kind? The way you answer these questions could change that student's life. Are you ready for that responsibility? We don't just model our playing for our students. We model our teaching philosophies and our values in every single lesson. Let me present for a moment this slide featuring portraits of the composers who contributed to the clarinet canon. Surprise, surprise, they are all long dead white Western European men. Culturally, the giant elephant in the room trumpeting away, the thing that is being talked about in all kinds of art, is representation. Seeing yourself or someone who looks like you on a screen, on a stage, or in a concert program makes a powerful impression, breaking open your conception of what is possible for you in your life. Additionally, as the American populace becomes increasingly non-white, with these groups consisting of around 40% of the total population, according to 2018 estimates by the US Census Bureau, it is very plainly in our best interest as teachers and performers to represent the growing diversity of the country in which we live with repertoire that stretches past the standard and the conventional in order to speak to the audiences and future artists that will sustain our ensembles, events, and academic programs. The iconic African-American science fiction novelist Octavia E. Butler once described her own struggles with the lack of representation in her field, writing, "What we don't see, we assume can't be. What a destructive assumption." Seriously investing in teaching repertoire by all kinds of women composers with the same rigor, context, and attention we teach Brahms cracks open that assumption so many women hold. Women can be composers, and their music is important, worthwhile, and profound. That's a fact that bears repeating. Programming and teaching with representation in mind are game-changing tools that need to become part of the way we do things on a day-to-day basis. Also, it is worth noting that expanding your conception of standard teaching repertoire just far enough to include additions by white, cisgender, heterosexual women composers, and no others is not the move. It's not enough. You don't get proverbial inclusivity points when that's your definition of a diverse curriculum. My very specific effort presented by this lecture is only one thread of an ongoing conversation involving hundreds of performers, activists, and teachers. This slide contains a short list of further resources representing the efforts of a huge number of people who are offering other perspectives and contributions to this conversation. I encourage you to research them and get excited about the work they are doing. Incorporating pieces by women composers into my clarinet studio curriculum is a small contribution I can make in support of a more inclusive set of best practices addressing the hidden curriculum I myself was taught. The standard studio curriculum of the clarinet maintains that the repertoire worth teaching includes works by Brahms, Mozart, Weber, and other prominent, long-dead white Western European men. The hidden curriculum implicit in an evaluation of the clarinet canon teaches students that by virtue of their exclusion, repertoire by women composers, composers of color, and queer composers, aside from Copland and Poulenc, is not important or useful in the fundamental teaching of the instrument. From a purely statistical standpoint, this idea is absurd. Out of the thousands of pieces currently cataloged in my database, there is a multitude of pieces that can address my pedagogical concerns, practical realities, and cultural concerns, while making sure that students don't have to wait to attempt Joan Towers' Wings in their senior year of undergrad in order to encounter a serious piece by a woman composer. There are as many ways to compose and make a life in music as there are people in this world, and students should be exposed to as many as possible as they begin their lifelong education as musicians and human beings. Now, it's one thing to talk about this gap in repertoire, to compile lists of pieces by women composers, to link to listicles listing 20 women composers you should know on your social media, and to implore everyone you've ever met to listen to their pieces. It's another thing entirely to invest time and effort in teaching and performing those pieces. That's where the rubber meets the road. The following program is meant to illustrate one actual possibility when these pieces are taken seriously enough to play together on a full-length recital that is both instructive and stylistically varied, without any entries from the standard teaching repertoire. Some pieces can be paired with canonic or important pieces in a bucket, such as Holmes and Adayevskaya. Some bridge gaps in skill between canonic or important pieces, such as Izara, Esmail, and Coleman. And others serve as an introduction to new techniques, musical resources, or contexts, such as On. A discussion of each piece in this program will include a brief biographical sketch of the composer, a description situating the piece in relation to the canon, and specific skills or goals addressed within the music, many of which overlap with the skills or goals discussed in the standard teaching repertoire, excerpts that correlate to regularly taught pieces, if applicable, and a performance of 2 or 3 excerpts that illustrate the piece's pedagogical value. Born in France in 1847 to Irish parents, Augusta Holmes came into her own as a prodigious musical talent by the 1870s. Though she was discouraged from taking music lessons by her mother and denied entry to the Paris Conservatory, she studied piano and composition privately with Henri Lambert, Hyacinthe Closet, and César Franck. Her most famous works were programmatic and political behemoths and include symphonic poems, choral works, and operas. Her fantasy for clarinet and piano from 1900, by contrast, is distinctly reduced in its forces, but still evokes her characteristic compositional bombast. Fantasy is a solo de concours, meaning it was commissioned as the end-of-year jury piece for all clarinet students to play at the Paris Conservatory. This piece slots directly between 2 regularly taught solo de concours, that of André Messager and Henri Ribot, and contains specific features reminiscent of both better-known pieces, while also maintaining the highly sectional construction and overall length of all pieces composed for this purpose. Consider the following passages. The entire first page of the Ribot Solo de Concours is a kind of accompanied cadenza. The marked tempo is merely a suggestion, for the piano's only job is to underpin basic tonic and dominant harmony for the first 8 measures. Beginning in measure 9, the piano rhythm becomes more active, suggesting a relatively steady tempo paired with a chromatically descending bass line as the clarinet plays arpeggios, wide descending leaps, and trills above. Blue arrows have been drawn to show the pianist's part. By contrast, the Holmes fantasy requires a higher level of score study from the clarinetist. Coordination is required between the clarinet and piano in nearly half the measures in this opening, with the added wrinkle of playing in octaves with the piano in the short passages indicated with brackets. Between these posts, the clarinetist can be free to experiment with tempo fluctuations, extreme dynamics, and tone colors, reminiscent of a vocalist acting their way through a late romantic accompanied recitative.